In the summer of 1993, inside a crowded airport terminal in Guadalajara, chaos erupted without warning. Gunfire echoed across polished floors as travelers dropped to the ground. Within minutes, the scene transformed into a battlefield. When the shooting stopped, one man lay dead, a Catholic cardinal, mistaken for someone else. It was a brazen act, one that sent shockwaves through Mexico and far beyond its borders. But the man behind it wasn't there. He rarely was. To understand how a rural boy from the mountains became one of the most powerful criminals in modern history, you have to go back much further, to a place where the law held little weight and survival often meant breaking it. In the late 1950s, in the rugged highlands of Sinaloa, Mexico, life was harsh and unforgiving. The Sierra Madre Occidental stretched across the region, a maze of steep ridges and isolated villages cut off from opportunity. Roads were scarce. Education was limited. Poverty was constant. It was here, in a small village called La Tuna, that Joaquín Guzmán Lora was born. The son of a poor farmer, Guzmán grew up in a household defined by hardship. His father cultivated opium poppies and marijuana, not as part of a grand criminal enterprise, but as a means of survival. In those mountains, illicit crops were often the only crops that paid. From an early age, Guzmán learned the rhythms of this underground economy. He understood how to plant, harvest, and move product without attracting attention. He also learned something else. That power didn't come from wealth alone, but from control. Those who controlled the routes controlled everything. By his early teens, Guzmán was already involved in the family trade. But unlike others around him, he wasn't content to remain a small-time farmer. There was ambition in him, quiet, calculated, and relentless. Stories from the region describe him as disciplined, even reserved. He wasn't the loudest voice in the room. He didn't seek attention, but he watched, he listened, and he learned. In the 1970s, Mexico's drug trade began to shift. The demand for marijuana and heroin in the United States was growing rapidly. Smuggling routes expanded, and with them, new opportunities emerged for those willing to take risks. Guzmán left La Tuna as a young man and began working for established traffickers. One of his early connections was with Héctor El Güero Palma, a figure who would later become both an ally and a key partner. But it was under the mentorship of Miguel Ángel Félix Gallardo, known as the Godfather, that Guzmán truly began to rise. Félix Gallardo was building something unprecedented, a centralized drug trafficking organization that coordinated shipments across Mexico and into the United States. It was structured, disciplined, and highly profitable. Guzmán became one of his trusted lieutenants. At first, his role was logistical. He managed routes, oversaw shipments, and ensured that product moved efficiently across borders. It was work that required precision and discretion, and Guzmán excelled at both. He earned a reputation for reliability. Shipments arrived on time, problems were handled quietly, and profits continued to grow. But behind that reliability was something more dangerous: ambition. By the early 1980s, the Guadalajara cartel had become a dominant force in the drug trade. Cocaine, sourced from South America, was now moving through Mexico in unprecedented quantities. The stakes were higher, the profits were staggering, and the risks were growing. In 1985, everything changed. A DEA agent named Enrique Kiki Camarena had been investigating the cartel's operations. His work posed a serious threat. When he was kidnapped, tortured, and murdered, the response from the United States was immediate and aggressive. Pressure mounted on the cartel. Arrests followed, and for the first time, the empire Félix Gallardo had built began to fracture. But while others panicked, Guzmán adapted. In the aftermath of Camarena's murder, the cartel leadership made a critical decision: to divide territories among trusted figures. It was a move intended to maintain control, but it had unintended consequences. It created independent power bases. Guzmán was given control of key trafficking routes, particularly those running through northern Mexico into the United States. These corridors were among the most valuable in the entire network, and Guzmán understood their worth. He began to build his own organization, one that operated with efficiency, secrecy, and ruthless precision. Unlike some of his contemporaries, Guzmán avoided unnecessary violence, at least at first. His focus was business, expansion, control, but the environment he operated in was anything but stable. Rival groups emerged, alliances shifted, and the line between strategy and brutality became increasingly blurred. By the late 1980s, Guzman had established himself as a major figure in the drug trade. His network extended across multiple states. His influence was growing, and his name, though not yet widely known, carried weight in the underworld. But success in that world rarely goes unchallenged. In 1989, Felix Gallardo was arrested. It was a turning point. Without a central authority, the fragmented cartel structure began to splinter further. What had once been a coordinated operation devolved into competing factions, each fighting for territory, routes, and dominance. For Guzman, this was both a risk and an opportunity. He aligned himself with Palma and others, forming what would become known as the Sinaloa cartel. It wasn't yet the global powerhouse it would later become, but its foundation was solid, built on strategic routes, disciplined operations, and a leadership willing to adapt. But power attracts attention, and with it, conflict. One of Guzman's primary rivals was the Tijuana cartel, led by the Arellano Felix family. The rivalry was intense, fueled by disputes over territory and control of key border crossings. Tensions escalated quickly. Violence followed. Assassinations, ambushes, and public displays of force became increasingly common. The drug trade in Mexico was no longer operating in the shadows. It was spilling into the streets, and Guzman was at the center of it. Yet despite the chaos, his organization continued to grow. He invested in infrastructure, safe houses, transportation networks, and communication systems that allowed operations to run smoothly. He cultivated relationships with corrupt officials, ensuring protection and intelligence. And perhaps most importantly, he remained elusive. Law enforcement knew his name, but they couldn't catch him. At least, not yet. Because in the world Guzman had entered, success was never permanent. Every move created new enemies. Every alliance carried risk. And every decision had consequences. By the early 1990s, Guzman had transformed from a mountain-born farmer into one of the most influential figures in Mexico's criminal landscape. But the foundation he had built was fragile. The violence was escalating. The authorities were closing in. And the incident at the Guadalajara airport would soon mark a turning point. Not just for Guzman, but for the entire country. Because sometimes, one mistake is all it takes. And the story was only beginning. In the days following the assassination at the Guadalajara airport in May of 1993, the atmosphere across Mexico shifted dramatically. What had once been a shadow war between rival cartels was now impossible to ignore. The killing of Cardinal Juan Jesus Posadas Ocampo, a figure far removed from the criminal world, forced the government into action. The official explanation pointed to a case of mistaken identity. Authorities claimed the cardinal had been caught in the crossfire of a shootout between rival groups, one of them linked to Joaquín Guzmán Lora. But behind the scenes, pressure was mounting from every direction. The United States demanded accountability. Mexican officials faced growing scrutiny. And for Guzman, the consequences came swiftly. Within weeks, he was captured in Guatemala. It was a moment that should have ended his rise. Instead, it became the beginning of something far more complex. Guzman was extradited back to Mexico and imprisoned in a maximum security facility. To the public, it appeared as though one of the most dangerous figures in the drug trade had finally been contained. But prisons in Mexico during the 1990s operated under a different reality. Inside the walls, power didn't disappear, it simply changed form. Guzman adapted quickly. Through a combination of bribery, influence, and intimidation, he established control over his environment. Guards were paid, privileges were granted, communication lines remained open. From his cell, Guzman continued to run operations. Shipments moved, alliances held, and the organization he had helped build did not collapse. It evolved. Outside prison, the Sinaloa network continued to expand. Key figures like Héctor El Güero Palma maintained operations, ensuring that the flow of narcotics into the United States remained uninterrupted. Cocaine routes from Colombia were refined. Marijuana and heroin production increased, and new methods of transportation began to emerge, including sophisticated tunnel systems beneath the U.S. Mexico border. These tunnels would later become one of the defining features of Guzman's empire. They were engineered with precision, complete with ventilation systems, lighting, and rail tracks. They allowed shipments to bypass traditional checkpoints, making detection far more difficult. It was innovation born out of necessity, and it worked. But while the business expanded, the violence never truly subsided. The rivalry with the Tijuana cartel intensified throughout the mid-1990s. Retaliatory attacks became more frequent. Public spaces were no longer off-limits. The lines between civilian life and cartel warfare blurred even further. Mexico was changing, and so was the nature of organized crime within it. Then, in 2001, everything changed again. On January 19th, under circumstances that would later become the subject of widespread controversy, Guzman escaped from prison. Official reports claimed he hid inside a laundry cart and was wheeled out of the facility. Others suggested a far more elaborate operation, one involving high-level corruption and coordinated assistance. Whatever the truth, the result was undeniable. He was free, and with that freedom came a new phase of power. By the early 2000s, the global drug trade had reached unprecedented levels. Demand in the United States remained high, while new markets began to emerge in Europe and beyond. Guzman moved quickly to capitalize on it. He reasserted control over the Sinaloa organization, strengthening its structure and expanding its reach. Under his leadership, the cartel became more than just a trafficking network. It became a multinational operation. Routes extended across Central America. Connections deepened in South America. Distribution networks spread throughout the United States. And profits soared. But expansion required more than logistics. It required alliances. Guzman formed strategic partnerships with Colombian suppliers, ensuring a steady flow of cocaine. He also built relationships with other Mexican groups when it served his interests, though these alliances were often temporary and fragile. Trust, in that world, was always conditional. One of the defining characteristics of Guzman's leadership was his ability to balance aggression with pragmatism. He knew when to negotiate and when to eliminate threats. And there were many threats. The Gulf Cartel, operating in eastern Mexico, posed a significant challenge. So did Los Zetas, a group originally formed by former military personnel who brought a new level of brutality to the conflict. These weren't just rival traffickers. They were organized, disciplined, and heavily armed. The violence escalated accordingly. By the mid-2000s, Mexico was experiencing a surge in cartel-related killings. Entire regions became battlegrounds. Cities like Ciudad Juarez saw thousands of deaths as groups fought for control of key crossing points. At the center of it all, Guzman's influence continued to grow. He diversified operations, moving beyond traditional drugs into methamphetamine production. Laboratories were established in remote areas, producing large quantities of the synthetic drug for export. It was a strategic move. Methamphetamine didn't rely on agricultural cycles. It could be produced year-round, offering consistent profits and greater control over supply. And Guzman understood the value of control. Financially, the organization became a powerhouse. Billions of dollars flowed through a network of shell companies, cash couriers, and international banking systems. Money laundering operations spanned multiple countries. Legitimate businesses were used as fronts, and despite ongoing investigations, much of it remained hidden. But with increased visibility came increased pressure. In 2006, the Mexican government launched a major crackdown on drug cartels. Backed by military forces, the campaign aimed to dismantle organized crime networks across the country. It marked the beginning of what would later be known as the Mexican Drug War. Troops were deployed, operations intensified, and for the first time in years, the state began to push back in a sustained and coordinated manner. Guzman responded in kind. His organization adapted to the new reality, shifting routes, altering communication methods, and reinforcing security measures. Corruption remained a key tool, allowing the cartel to maintain access to critical information. But the pressure was undeniable. Arrests increased, seizures grew larger, and the list of enemies expanded. Despite this, Guzman's public image took on an unexpected dimension. In certain regions, he was viewed not just as a criminal, but as a figure of influence. even a kind of folk hero. Stories circulated about acts of generosity, about money distributed to communities, about assistance provided where the government had failed. Whether these stories were true, exaggerated, or strategically cultivated, they served a purpose. They built loyalty. And in a world defined by shifting allegiances, loyalty was a powerful asset. Meanwhile, international attention intensified. The United States classified Guzmán as one of the most wanted individuals in the world. Intelligence agencies tracked his movements. Joint operations were conducted. Rewards were offered for information leading to his capture. But he remained elusive. He moved constantly. Safe houses changed frequently. Communication was tightly controlled, and those within his inner circle were carefully selected. For years, he managed to stay one step ahead. But no system is perfect. No network is impenetrable. And no empire lasts forever. By the early 2010s, cracks were beginning to show. Internal divisions emerged. Rival factions grew stronger. And law enforcement efforts became more sophisticated. Technology improved. Surveillance expanded. And the margin for error grew smaller. In 2014, after more than a decade on the run, Guzmán was finally captured once again. This time, in a beachfront apartment in Mazatlan. It was a quiet operation. No gunfire. No chaos. Just the end of a long pursuit. Or so it seemed. Because with Guzmán, endings had a way of becoming beginnings. And what happened next would once again defy expectations, reshaping not only his own story, but the global perception of power, corruption, and control. The empire he had built was still standing, but the forces closing in around it were stronger than ever. And the final chapter was approaching. In February of 2014, in the coastal city of Mazatlan, the operation unfolded with precision. Before dawn, Mexican Marines surrounded a modest beachfront condominium. The streets were quiet. There were no sirens, no dramatic pursuit. Inside, a man who had spent over a decade evading capture was asleep. When they entered the room, Joaquín Guzmán Lara didn't resist. There was no shootout, no final stand, just silence. For the second time in his life, the man known as El Chapo was in custody. But this time, the world was watching far more closely. Images of his arrest spread across international media within hours. Governments praised the operation. Officials declared a turning point in the fight against organized crime. But beneath the surface, there was skepticism, because history had already shown that capturing Guzmán didn't necessarily mean stopping him. He was transferred to Altiplano, a maximum security prison located west of Mexico City. Unlike the facilities of the 1990s, this prison was designed specifically to hold high-risk inmates. Surveillance was constant. Movement was restricted. Every detail of daily life was controlled. Authorities were determined not to repeat past mistakes. And for a time, it seemed they wouldn't. Inside the prison, Guzmán was isolated. Communication was limited. The systems in place were far more advanced than anything he had faced before. But outside, the organization he had built was still operating. The Sinaloa cartel remained one of the most powerful criminal networks in the world. Its infrastructure was intact. Its routes were active. Its leadership, though fragmented, was still capable. And within that network, loyalty to Guzmán had not disappeared. It had simply gone quiet. For more than a year, there were no major incidents. No signs of instability within the prison. No obvious breaches in security. Then, on the night of July 11th, 2015, everything changed. At approximately 8:52 p.m., surveillance cameras captured Guzmán entering the shower area of his cell. It was one of the few locations not directly visible on camera, a standard privacy measure within the facility. Minutes passed, and then he was gone. When guards entered the cell, they found an opening in the floor. Beneath it, a tunnel. It stretched more than a mile in length, equipped with lighting, ventilation, and even a modified motorcycle mounted on rails to transport materials. The level of engineering was extraordinary, a testament to planning, resources, and coordination on a scale rarely seen. Guzmán had escaped again. The news spread instantly. International outrage followed. How could a prisoner under such tight security simply vanish? The answer, as many suspected, lay not just in the tunnel, but in the system itself. Investigations revealed signs of corruption. Officials were questioned. Some were arrested. But the full extent of the operation, who was involved, how it was executed, remained partially obscured. What was clear was that Guzmán was once again free. And with that freedom came renewed urgency. The manhunt intensified. This time, it wasn't just a national effort. It was global. Intelligence agencies coordinated across borders. Surveillance operations expanded. Every known associate, every suspected safe house, every financial trail was scrutinized. But Guzmán had learned from decades of experience. He stayed mobile. He avoided predictable patterns. And he relied on a network that had been built over years of calculated trust. Still, the pressure was different now. Technology had advanced. Digital communication left traces. Intelligence sharing between countries had improved significantly. The margin for error was shrinking. In October of 2015, Mexican forces came close to capturing him in the mountains of Sinaloa. A raid was launched based on intercepted communications. But Guzmán escaped once again, reportedly fleeing through rugged terrain he knew intimately. It was a reminder of where his story had begun, in those same mountains, among the same landscapes that had shaped him. But the world around him had changed, and so had the stakes. In January of 2016, just months after that near capture, Guzmán's run came to an end. This time, in the city of Los Mochis. The operation was fast and decisive. Marines moved in before dawn, engaging in a brief but intense firefight. Guzmán attempted to flee through a network of tunnels once again, emerging from a sewer system blocks away. But this time, there was nowhere left to go. He was captured, for the third time, and this time, there would be no second chances. Within days, discussions began regarding his extradition to the United States. For years, American authorities had sought to bring him to trial, believing that Mexico's prison system could not contain him. In January of 2017, those discussions became reality. Guzmán was extradited to the United States and transferred to New York, where he would face a series of federal charges, including drug trafficking, money laundering, and involvement in violent criminal activities. The trial began in November of 2018. Inside a federal courtroom in Brooklyn, prosecutors laid out the case against him. It was comprehensive, built on years of investigation, testimony from former associates, and extensive evidence. Witnesses described the inner workings of the Sinaloa cartel. They spoke of shipments measured in tons, of bribes paid to officials at every level, of violence used to maintain control. The image that emerged was not just of a single man, but of an entire system. A system that had operated across continents. A system that had generated billions. And a system that had, for years, remained just out of reach. Guzmán himself sat through the proceedings, largely silent. The man who had once controlled vast networks now found himself confined to a courtroom, his fate in the hands of a jury. In February of 2019, the verdict was delivered. Guilty on all counts. Months later, he was sentenced to life in prison, plus 30 years, without the possibility of parole. He was transferred to ADX Florence in Colorado, a facility often referred to as the most secure prison in the United States. Inside, conditions are stark. Isolation is extreme. Communication is minimal. It is designed for those considered too dangerous to be held anywhere else. And for the first time in his life, Guzmán's ability to influence the world outside those walls was effectively cut off. The empire he had built did not disappear overnight. The Sinaloa cartel continues to operate, though its leadership has evolved. New figures have emerged. Old alliances have shifted. But the era of El Chapo had come to an end, or at least the era of his direct control. Because influence, once established, doesn't simply vanish. It lingers in the routes that remain active, in the structures that continue to function, and in the legacy of a man who rose from poverty to become one of the most powerful figures in the global drug trade. But that legacy is complicated. To some, he is remembered as a ruthless criminal, responsible for violence, addiction, and instability on a